The
Why have
Underhive
you
doesn't sleep.
stopped?
It groans,
Keep moving,
breathes,
or you will be left
weeps
behind.
through the pipes and
We
the vents
can't.
like a dying
The
god
passage is
remembering what
blocked
it
up
felt
ahead.
like to be alive.
Help me!
Down here, light doesn't
Someone
exist.
help me!
Only reflections. Pale glows from
Get
chemical
back
vats.
here!
Sparks
You are
from dying
not leaving
machines.
this place.
The dim pulse of reactor
Look at you
hearts miles
now.
above.
Broken,
Shadows don't just hide things in the
pathetic.
Underhive.
Your
They hold them.
defiance was meaningless.
Kale Varus had lived in those shadows his whole
Your
life.
compliance
He used
is
to be a smuggler,
mandatory.
though that word didn't mean much
We
anymore.
are
Everyone
the
in the Underhive was a
architects of the
smuggler,
new
whether it
flesh.
was chems, data slates, or air filters. What mattered wasn't what you traded, but who you stole it from. Kyle's mistake was stealing from the Guild of Flesh. He remembered the day the deal went wrong, the burning taste of recycled whiskey, the flicker of faulty lumen strips. The crates he'd moved were supposed to hold medical supplies for a dying sector. They didn't. Inside were the Guild's own assets. Half-living servitors and frozen organs with Imperial seals still stamped in wax. They were worth more than his entire life. He'd taken the job because he was desperate. Everyone down here was. The last thing he remembered before the sirens had gone off was the sound of the Vox signal. A calm, static voice whispering the 3 words every hiver feared. Debt acquired. Collection pending. That was 6 months ago. Now Kale was crawling through a maintenance conduit 3 meters high, the air so thick with dust he could taste iron with every breath. His respirator rasped against his jaw, one filter cracked, the other clogged. Each time he inhaled, it felt like breathing through oil. His eyes burned from the fumes rising off the waste channels below. He stopped only when he heard it, the low metallic hum of servos winding somewhere in the dark. Collectors. They never ran. They didn't need to. Kyle flattened himself against the wall, pressing his ear to the cold metal. The hum grew louder, followed by the faint rhythm of boots. 2 pairs. No, 3. He could hear the static-laced murmurs of their Vox grills, the way they spoke in clipped bursts of coded syllables. He'd learned enough to understand one thing. They already knew he was here. The Guild always knew. He crawled faster, his palms slipping on slick grime, every muscle screaming. He could feel the heat of their scanning lamps cutting through the corridor behind him. His body ached from hunger and exhaustion. The last real meal he'd had was a nutrient paste stolen from a dead ganger's pouch. It tasted like rust and chemical ash, but it had kept him alive. Barely. The tunnel ended in a vertical shaft lined with pipes that climbed into blackness. At the bottom, dim lights flickered like dying stars. He had 2 choices. Down meant the sump. No one came back from the sump. Up meant the core vents. If he climbed fast enough, he might reach the old manufactorum levels before the collector's drones locked onto his heat signature. He didn't think. He climbed. Every rung was slick with condensation, every breath a knife in his throat. The air was hotter here, steam from the reactor lines. His hands bled, skin peeling as he pulled himself higher. Somewhere below, the sound of boots turned to grinding metal. Then silence. Kyle froze. He waited, his body pressed against the pipe, every heartbeat echoing in his ears. A voice rose from below, mechanical, yet horribly human. Kyle Varus, it rasped through static. Your debt has come due. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The voice came again, closer now. Payment in flesh. Interest in pain. He looked down. Through the haze, 3 figures emerged. They weren't armored like enforcers, or built like Goliath brutes. They were thin, too thin. Their limbs were elongated, jointed in wrong places. Pale skin stretched over cables. Their faces were covered with iron masks shaped like coins, expressionless, stamped with the Guild's sigil. Collectors. Each one carried a different instrument. One had a hook-like augmetic arm dripping with acid. Another dragged a serrated staff that sparked each time it touched metal. The third, the tallest, carried nothing but a ledger, its pages bound in human skin. Kale climbed faster. His lungs screamed. Above him, the shaft opened into a narrow platform. He pulled himself up, slipping on the metal grating, rolling onto his side. His heart was hammering so hard it hurt. Then he saw it. A door. Heavy, rusted, marked with the symbol of House Orlok. A freight gang long extinct. He didn't care what was behind it. Anything was better than this. He shoved his shoulder against the door. It didn't move. He hit it again. The metal groaned, but held. Below, the collectors had begun climbing. Kale could hear the scrape of their hooks on the ladder. Sparks fell like embers through the dark. He screamed silently, throwing his weight against the door one last time. The hinge snapped. He fell through as it burst open, rolling onto the cold floor of whatever chamber lay beyond. The door slammed shut behind him. For a moment, there was only darkness. Then, light. Not clean light, not pure, a sickly amber glow pulsing from glass cylinders that lined the walls. Each one held a shape inside, human or something close. Bodies submerged in viscous fluid, their eyes half open, their mouths wired shut. Some were missing limbs, others were fused to machines. The air was thick with formaldehyde and electricity. Cale staggered backward, his hand covering his mouth. He knew where he was now, an old flesh pit. A place where the guild once grew its servitors. Vat-born slaves built from the debtors who couldn't pay. He looked at their faces, the hollow stares, the faint tremor of fingers still twitching inside the glass. Some of them were still alive. A low hum began again, different from before. Deeper. Older. From the center of the chamber, a machine rose, a towering mass of steel and tubing, its surface etched with 1,000 names. At its core was a man, or what was left of one. His flesh had long since fused to the metal. Cables ran from his chest to the tanks around him. His face was gone, replaced by a cracked vox grill. Cale stumbled forward, half in horror, half in awe. The machine spoke. "You owe what cannot be forgiven." Its voice was ancient, filled with static and sorrow. Cale shook his head. "I didn't mean to—" "Meaning is irrelevant," it interrupted. "Debt is eternal. Your life belongs to the guild." Kyle took a step back, his hand brushing against one of the tanks. The body inside twitched violently. The fluid turned black. He turned to run, but the door was gone. In its place was only smooth metal, sealed as if it had never existed. The machine's eyes, or what passed for them, flared with light. "You cannot run from what you owe, Cale Varys. Every breath you take is borrowed. Every heartbeat is interest." Cale screamed as the tanks around him shattered, spilling liquid and bodies onto the floor. The dead began to crawl, their limbs twitched with mechanical precision, guided by unseen code. And as the machine leaned closer, Cale saw his own reflection in the metal. His face was pale, eyes hollow, veins dark with something that wasn't blood. It took him a moment to understand. He hadn't escaped the collectors. He'd already been caught. There are no dawns in the Underhive. The light never changes. It simply flickers, dies, and comes back weaker. For Cale Varys, that meant the night never ended. The world stayed the same shade of rusted black, humming with the slow decay of a civilization too stubborn to die and too corrupt to be reborn. He didn't remember how long he had been lying there. The chamber had gone silent again, save for the faint hiss of leaking fluid and the slow pulse of the machine's dying glow. The bodies that had spilled from the tanks were motionless now, tangled masses of metal and flesh. They looked almost peaceful, if peace could smell like burning oil and dead air. Cale pushed himself upright, his chest aching. His veins burned. His reflection in a broken shard of glass made him flinch. His skin was turning gray, his eyes lined with veins as dark as ink. He could feel something inside him, moving with his heartbeat, whispering in the rhythm of his pulse. He tore open his shirt and stared. Along his ribs, small metal nodes had grown beneath his skin. Implants, feeding into his nervous system. They pulsed faintly with light. The guild had already begun to claim him. He slammed his fist into the wall until the pain reminded him he was still his own. The machine spoke again, its voice fractured but still heavy with authority. "You cannot destroy what is already owed." Kyle turned toward it. "You're not real," he hissed. "You're just another guild trick." "Reality," it answered, "is the interest accrued on memory." He backed away, breathing hard. "Where's the exit?" "Debt has no exit." Cale's vision swam. The walls around him seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the implants under his skin. The faces in the tanks stared at him, not pleading, not angry, just watching. He stumbled through the darkness until his hand brushed against a maintenance hatch half buried under debris. He yanked it open and climbed down into a narrower tunnel. He didn't know where it led, and he didn't care. Anything was better than the silence behind him. The tunnels below were older. He could feel it in the air, colder, heavier, thick with dust. Rust had eaten through most of the metal. The floor was littered with skeletal remains of old servitors, their limbs frozen mid-task. A single lumen fly drifted past, its glow reflecting off wet walls. Kyle followed it. He moved slowly, his hands brushing the wall for balance. Every sound echoed, every drip, every step. When he stopped to breathe, he could hear something else in the distance. A steady rhythm. Metal on stone, slow, measured. The collectors were near. He ducked behind a pile of collapsed piping as the sound grew louder. He could see faint light cutting through the fog ahead. The white beam of scanning lamps. Shadows moved inside it, tall, Angular, jerky in their movements like puppets being pulled by broken strings. They were dragging something. Kale strained to see through the gloom. It was a body. No, not just one. Several. Each chained together, wrists bound with wires, heads encased in cages. He recognized one of them. Tarnot, a friend from before the debt. Kale felt his chest tighten. He hadn't seen Tarn in months. Not since the guild raid on the refinery. The last rumor he'd heard was that Tarn had joined the Steel Vultures, a gang crazy enough to steal from the enforcers themselves. Now he was here, limp, his skin pale and slick with blood. One of the collectors stopped. It turned its head with a hiss of pneumatics, the light of its mask sweeping across the corpses. Kale froze as the beam passed within inches of him. The creature's voice crackled through its vox grill. "Ledger update, collection complete," another answered. "Verification required." Kale could hear static, followed by the soft hum of a data slate being accessed. The collectors began to speak in a dead dialect of Binharich, their words short and mechanical. He caught fragments of meaning. Numbers, names, values. It wasn't conversation. It was bookkeeping. That's when Kyle understood. Every debtor wasn't just hunted. They were processed, recorded, cataloged. Their deaths were transactions, credits, and debits in a system that no longer needed people. Only proof. He felt sick. The collectors lifted Tarn's body and pinned it against the wall. With one motion, they removed his chest plate. Kale bit his fist to keep from making a sound. A thin blade extended from the collector's wrist. It slid between Tarn's ribs with surgical precision. Blood hissed as it hit the cold metal floor. The collector reached inside and removed a small metallic disc from Tarn's heart. A guild implant, glistening with bioelectric charge. The machine's voice came again. Debt cleared. Kale wanted to run. Every instinct screamed to, but his legs wouldn't move. The collectors turned and began to drag the remaining bodies away, their chains scraping along the floor. Their footsteps echoed into the dark until only the silence remained, heavy, absolute. He waited another minute, maybe two, before crawling from his hiding place. He knelt beside Tarn's body, his hands trembling. His friend's eyes were open, staring at nothing. The wound in his chest still steamed. Kale closed his eyes and whispered the only prayer he remembered. Not to the Emperor, not to any god, but to the Underhive itself. The only god that had ever listened. When he stood again, his rage had replaced his fear. He followed the trail of the collectors. The tunnel led him deeper than he'd ever gone, beneath even the guild's known routes. The air grew warmer. He could hear machinery again, the low rhythmic churn of pistons. A faint blue light began to pulse through the pipes above, flowing like veins. He stepped through a narrow breach and found himself standing on a catwalk overlooking a vast chamber, easily the size of a manufacturum dome. Below him stretched a field of machines, each one identical to the ones he'd seen above, each with tanks filled with fluid and suspended bodies. Hundreds of them. Thousands. He realized what this place was. The collectors didn't just hunt. They made more of themselves. The guild wasn't an organization. It was a factory. Every debtor who failed to pay wasn't killed. They were recycled, turned into tools, their bodies reforged into the next generation of collectors. Tarn would rise again, not as a man, but as another mask in the dark. Kale felt the bile rise in his throat. He saw figures moving along the catwalk below. Guild engineers, faces obscured by sealed helmets marking each tank with symbols. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The machines were alive enough for both of them. And then Kale saw something worse. On a central dais stood a figure in crimson robes, taller than any human. Its face was covered by a gilded mask shaped like a skull, its body humming with hidden machinery. In its hand, it held a long staff crowned with the guild sigil, a coin pierced by a needle, the guildmaster of flesh. The air itself seemed to bend around him. Kale could feel his presence like static under his skin. The guildmaster turned as if he had been waiting. "Kale Varys," he said. Not shouted, not transmitted, just spoken. And yet the words filled the entire chamber. "You took what was not yours. You live on borrowed breath. Do you understand what that means?" Kale tried to step back, but the metal beneath him groaned. "It means," the guildmaster continued, "you are valuable." The lights flickered. The tanks began to drain. The bodies inside them stirred. Collectors. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Crawling free of their birthing fluid, their limbs jerking as they learned movement again. Kale turned and ran. Alarms screamed. The engineers shouted in Binharik. The floor shook under the pounding of metal feet. Kale didn't look back. He could feel the heat of the machines behind him. Hear the echoing rhythm of pursuit, mechanical, endless. He dove into a waste chute, tumbling through the filth and machinery until he slammed into a lower platform. His vision blurred. Every bone in his body felt broken. Above, the guildmaster's voice echoed once more. Calm, patient, inevitable. You cannot run from what you owe. Cale Varys, the night is eternal and the collectors are awake. Cale pushed himself to his feet. He wiped the blood from his mouth. He wasn't running anymore. Cale's fall ended in silence. The metal beneath him was warm and slick with condensation, a heartbeat thudding faintly through it. The pulse of the hive itself. His lungs burned. Every breath came shallow and ragged, as if the air itself rejected him. He could taste iron, oil, something bitter and alive. He lay there listening. No footsteps above, no mechanical voices, just the distant hum of pipes and the slow drip of liquid falling into darkness. He wasn't dead. Not yet. When he finally moved, his joints screamed. His hands trembled as he pulled himself upright. A faint orange glow bled through. The pipes around him, a light too rhythmic to be electrical. Firelight. He followed it. The tunnel opened into a wide chamber where molten metal ran like blood through open channels. The heat hit him like a wave. Shapes moved in the haze. Massive, broad-shouldered silhouettes swinging hammers the size of his torso. Their skin gleamed like oiled leather, thick with scars and augmetic plates. House Goliath. He'd heard the stories. Chemborn giants bred in the vats. Half men and half machines. Worshippers of strength and fire. The Goliaths didn't fear the guild. They didn't fear anything. They sold fear. Cale stumbled forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I need help." One of them turned. His face was pale beneath the soot, eyes glowing red from implanted optics. The hammer in his hand was still burning at the tip. "No one needs anything down here," the giant said, his voice like gravel. "You either earn or you die." Kyle swallowed, his throat dry. "The guild, they're after me." That made the giant smile. "Then you've already earned your death." The others laughed, the sound deep and harsh. Cale took a step back. "I can pay," he said quickly. "Not in credits, information. I've seen their core. Their breeding vats. Their guildmaster." That made them stop. The giant lowered his hammer. "You've seen the Flesh Guild's heart?" Cale nodded, though his vision swayed. "They're not human anymore. They're building something. An army. I saw the vats. I saw my friend turned into one of them." For a moment, the air shifted. The laughter stopped. The Goliath leader stepped closer, towering over Cale. His breath smelled like oil and metal dust. "And what would a rat like you offer in return for protection?" Cale met his gaze. "Blood. Mine." The giant tilted his head. "Explain." "I know the guild tracks bloodlines. Contracts written in genes. They use blood to mark their slaves, to bind them to the ledger. You want to hurt them? You need someone with guild blood to get inside their systems. That's me." The Goliath's expression darkened. "You'd sell your own blood?" Cale laughed, though it came out hollow. "It's all I have left." The giant stared for a long moment, then grinned. "You've got spirit, rat. I like that. Maybe we can use you before you die." He turned and barked a command. Two Goliaths dragged Cale toward a glowing forge, where molten metal dripped into molds shaped like skulls. The air stank of iron and burnt flesh. "Hold him," the leader said. Cale struggled. "What are you?" The giant dipped a blade into the molten channel, lifting it as it hissed and sparked. "You want to be under Goliath's protection? You bleed for it. Flesh for flesh. Strength for strength." He pressed the blade to Cale's arm. The metal burned through skin and sinew in one clean stroke. Cale screamed, the sound drowned by the forge's roar. The Goliath caught his wrist, forcing the bleeding stump into a vat of glowing red liquid. It wasn't molten metal. It was something thicker. Chemical grafting fluid. It hissed as it touched flesh, searing nerve endings shut. The pain was beyond anything Cale had ever known. When the giant pulled his arm free, it wasn't an arm anymore. It was metal, a grafted augmetic limb, crudely fused to the bone, veins soldered to the internal cables. It moved when he thought, slow, heavy, but his. The Goliath grinned. "Now you're half one of us. A forged man. Flesh for flesh." Cale collapsed, gasping. You've killed me." The leader laughed. "No. We've made you useful." They left him by the fire to recover. Hours passed, maybe days. The pain never faded. It simply became part of him. The limb ached with every heartbeat, humming faintly like a machine learning to breathe. When he could finally stand, the leader approached again. "You said you saw their vats," he said. "Their guildmaster." Cale nodded. "Then you'll guide us," the giant said. "We'll burn the guild's wombs and tear their ledgers from their cold hands." Kyle looked at his arm, the steel glinting in the forge light. And after? The Goliath grinned. After, you die free. Better than most. Kyle almost smiled. Better than most, he echoed. But deep inside, he knew there was no freedom in the Underhive. There were only new chains. That night, as he lay in the darkness, he dreamt of the machine that had spoken to him. Its voice echoed through his head. Debt is eternal. When he woke, the Goliaths were ready. A small warband armed with chain axes, flamethrowers, and rage. They moved through the tunnels like a storm, Kyle limping behind, the metal in his arm glowing faintly in the dark. As they neared the guild's lower levels, the air changed. The smell of chemicals thickened. The walls began to pulse with faint bioluminescence. Kyle stopped. They know we're coming, the Goliath leader grinned, showing his steel teeth. Good. The first collector appeared from the shadows. Tall, skeletal, its limbs spider-like. The Goliath swung his hammer, and the creature shattered against the wall in a burst of sparks and bone. Another leapt forward, impaling one of the giants before being torn apart by flame. Kyle ducked, firing a stolen stub pistol into the dark. Each shot echoed like thunder. The air was thick with smoke and screams, metal and flesh grinding together. Then Kale saw it. The guild's sigil burning on the far wall, drawn in blood. Beneath it, a door. Heavy. Sealed. The heart, he whispered. He ran toward it, his new arm smashing through debris with unnatural strength. Behind him, the Goliaths fought and died, their war cries turning into roars of pain. Kale slammed his palm against the sigil. The metal beneath his skin pulsed, and the door opened. Inside was silence, rows of machines stretched into infinity, each one humming with life. Tanks filled with liquid light, bodies suspended inside, not half dead, but alive, breathing, dreaming. And in the center, a single throne of bone and circuitry. Upon it sat the Guildmaster of Flesh. Welcome home, Kale Varys, the Guildmaster said. Kale raised his pistol. His hand trembled. I'm not yours, the Guildmaster smiled. You always were. He lifted a single finger, and Kale's new arm locked. The metal hummed, wires tightening around his veins. Pain flooded his body. You gave me your blood, the Guildmaster whispered. You gave me your flesh. And now I collect. Kale fell to his knees. The Goliath war cries faded behind him, replaced by mechanical chants. The tanks around him began to drain. Collectors stepped free once more, not to fight, but to kneel. Kale looked up at them, and saw his own face staring back from their mirrored masks, his reflection. Duplicated. Perfect. He understood then. The guild hadn't just claimed his debt. They had copied him, turned him into the next collector. He wasn't fighting them. He was them. The throne's voice did not grow louder. It grew nearer, as if the words walked across the floor and leaned into Kale's ear. Metal clenched inside his veins, and the augmetic arm he had bartered from the Goliaths locked at the elbow with a whine, the fingers splaying open in a gesture that was not his. The Guildmaster's skull mask regarded him as if he were a number finally lining up with its column. Around the dais, tanks sighed and lowered their dead dreams to the floor. The newborn collectors moved like insects discovering their legs, each step a lesson, each breath a ledger entry come true. Cal tried to drag in air that did not want him. The chamber tasted like electrified brine in the inside of a wound. He could hear the war above, a distant percussion of chain teeth on bone and men bellowing their last names as if names could turn steel. The sound here was different. Quieter. Contractual. 1,000 small mechanisms recording. Stamping, indexing, feeding fresh decisions into an ancient appetite. You feel it now, the Guildmaster said. His words trembled the conduits. The bond is not metaphor, Kale Varys. It was written into your blood before you were born. Something loosened in the augmetic wrist, and the fingers twitched. One, then two, like fish dying on a deck. The Guildmaster let him have that much motion and no more, the way a tallyman will let a debtor keep a keepsake to ensure they come back for the rest. What debt? Kale whispered. What did we steal that cost this much? The skull tilted, indulgent. Breath. The chamber's lights dimmed as if in shame. All at once, Kale saw the route his life had taken, but traced backward, the cracked filters, the trade of recycled masks in sudslick markets, the hiss of rent air traded between strangers in alleys whose ceilings dripped. Breath had been currency so long that no one remembered the first sale. Your line, the Guildmaster continued, descends from the Orlok Charterers who diverted an atmosphere feed during the second expansion. A crime done with a turn of a wheel and a signature. When the audit came, the wheels could not be unwound, and signatures do not burn. The Lex Collecta Perpetua was invoked. Eternal collection, until the sum resolves. Kyle wanted to deny it, but the denial withered before it reached his mouth. He saw his grandfather's tattoos, the long coil of numbers along the ribs that no one could explain. The way old men in his hab stopped laughing when the vent sirens blared. How his mother counted heartbeats when she thought no one was watching. The way a merchant counts coin by ear. "You could have killed me," he said, not sure who he accused. "You could have taken the body and left the counting to ghosts." The guildmaster's voice softened until it almost resembled pity. "Ghosts forget. Steel does not." Something shuddered under the dais. Bulkhead plates slid aside with a grind and revealed a throat of stairs descending into a glow the color of old honey. Heat rose up the steps in slow breaths. The guildmaster lifted his staff and the newborn collectors parted like a hinge opening. "Come," he said. "Know why you cannot be free." The arm would not let Kale refuse. It lifted him, guided him, and lowered him to the first stair. Each step rang with a hollow timbre that vibrated through his bones and into the augmetic until he felt like a note trapped between the teeth of a tuning fork. The air grew warmer, denser, tasting of oxidized copper and boiled salt. The deeper he went, the older everything felt, as if age had a weight. The stairs ended in a hall of pillars carved from machinery that no longer existed anywhere else. They rose in rows, each one wrapped in coils of whispering cable and studded with plates engraved so tightly that sentences became textures and law became skin. Between the pillars lay a floor of translucent plasteel with veins of light flowing beneath, slow as syrup. Kale stopped on the threshold because reverence is partly instinct. Something here asked not to be hurried. He had come into a memory. It was not a room for men. It was a mind the size of a manufactorum, a cathedral of calculus. The pillars were not pillars. They were logic trees petrified into metal. The plates were not decoration. They were clauses, oaths, appendices, riders, revisions, retroactive dispensations. Every compromise ever made to keep a hive alive had been etched here with a scribe's cruelty. He could read none of it, and he could read all of it, because the meaning rose off the steel like heat. "Before the houses," the guildmaster said, voice echoing beautifully in a place that loved voices. "Before gangs learned to call themselves families and chattel learned the shape of their chains. Before that, there was a manufactorum that owned the night and made it day. It forged the first lungs for this city." Kale looked down through the plasteel at the rivers of light and realized they were not coolant or power. They were data, millions of debts streaming like runoff after a rain that fell 10,000 years ago and never stopped. In the early tithe years, the guildmaster continued, administratum auditors discovered that calculation could save more lives than mercy. This hall was raised. They named it the Nemifero Lattice. We call it the memory of steel. Its machine spirit remembers every breath rationed, every lumen hour issued, every calorie turned back into work. It holds the hive's promise to itself and the hive's threat to its children. 100 servo skulls drifted from the shadowed vaults, candles guttering on their brows, quills twitching. Their eye lenses irised and fixed on Kale as if he were a forgotten addendum. The augmetic in his arm tightened, and he understood that the arm too could read this place, that it was a key he had carried without knowing a door existed. "Why show me?" he asked. "Why not take what you want and stamp it with my name like all the names below?" The skull mask looked past him to the pillars as if listening for approval. "Because there is a limit to even the patience of steel. The lattice does not merely store debts. It seeks resolution. It has waited 330 generations for your line to present payment. The fiction of coin amuses it no longer. You are acceptable tender." The ridiculousness of anger broke across Kale's face, and then burned away, leaving something cleaner. He took a breath through the pain, and tasted nothing but machines. "So that's the mercy you offer. Make me into a collector and call the account closed." "Not closed," the guildmaster said. "Balanced." He motioned, and the nearest pillar relaxed a fraction, a panel unfurling like a segmented eyelid. Within, in a cavity lit by a single witchlight, rested a book. Not a data slate, not a spool, a book. Leather warped with humidity, edges black with finger grease. Spine repaired twice with stitching, and once with a rivet. Kyle did not want to touch it, which meant he had to. He reached with the hand that was still his and found the leather warm, as if someone had left it under a lamp until it remembered being skin. When he opened it, the scent that rose was not of mold, but of breath that had sunk into pages and stayed. The first page bore a title in a clerk's carefully rehearsed hand. Decree remissive on atmosphere theft and the perpetuity of redress. Beneath, a column of names. Orlok, Varus. His line was a thread that ran the full height of the book, stopping not at a margin, but with an arrow that disappeared into the binding. The ink of certain entries had etched deeper, as if pressed by a clerk annoyed at late payment. He found the incident the guildmaster had spoken of, a siphon, rerouted during an expansion and never properly returned, signed with a flourish by a man who had believed that letters were a kind of armor. Cale ran his thumb along a notation, written centuries later in a smaller hand, transferred to the Guild of Flesh for collection in perpetuity. He closed his eyes and pictured the man who wrote that. The little noise his tongue would have made when the quill blotted. He wondered how many people had suffocated to make the handwriting steady. The directive that birthed the first collectors is simple, the guildmaster said. All debts must be paid. It began with criminal breathers. It grew into a system when men discovered that breathing could be priced. It is easy to sell a man his air when the alternative is a last story told in a corridor that no one will remember. Cale stood very still so the anger would not slop over the sides and be wasted. What happens if I break your book? The lattice remembers without paper, the guildmaster said, amused. Destroy the leaf and the sentence remains in the pillars, in the logic, in the way the cogitators speak to the vents. The memory is metal, Kyle Varus. It can be scarred by flame, not erased by it. The arm spasmed without permission, fingers drumming on the cover in time with a deeper rhythm that Cale thought was his pulse, until he realized it was memory moving under his feet. A thought, half-formed, caught and lengthened. You said the lattice seeks resolution. It is what machine spirits desire, the guildmaster said. The closing of loops. What if the payment is not coin or flesh? Cale said, surprised that the idea held together as he spoke it. What if the loop closes another way? What if debt writes itself into a different book? The skull mask was very still. The servo skulls drew nearer, quills scratching as if they could record a thought before it finished thinking. The newborn collectors on the stairs were silent as icons. The staff in the guildmaster's hand rotated a degree. Explain, he said. Cale swallowed and let the words fall in the order his life had taught him. This lattice feeds orders to the vents. It decides who breathes, how much, for how long. If air is debt, then debt is air. If debt stops, the vents stop. If the vents stop... Above the lattice, the hive stirred like a sleeping beast whose lungs had just remembered how to move. Air vented from cracks long sealed, carrying dust that had not known motion in 1,000 years. In the sump markets, merchants looked up from their stalls as filters sighed open and stale gas fled like spirits. The children of the Underhive coughed once, twice, and then laughed without knowing why. Far below, the guildmaster of flesh stood alone beside the book that still bled heat. The collectors had gone silent again, waiting like statues that remembered being men. Only one moved, the one whose mask bore the faintest distortion, as if someone had pressed a human palm into the metal while it was still soft. Designation? The guildmaster asked, his voice faint against the roaring silence. The collector answered in the quiet tone of a prayer. Cale Varus. The guildmaster inclined his head. Impossible. The ledger closed. The collector lifted its mask slightly, and for a heartbeat the reflection of the room bent. Not a face, but a flicker of something still alive inside. The machine spirit of the lattice, perhaps, or something older that had finally learned mercy. The ledger closed, Cale's voice repeated through the grill. But the breath remains. He turned his head upward, hearing the hum of the ducts and the long sigh of wind returning to the hive. Every breath above was one of his. Every life that would wake tomorrow was a continuation of what he had traded. He felt the lattice inside him now, the rhythm of the machine no longer a prison, but a pulse he shared. It did not command him. It remembered him. The code that had once bound his bloodline to the guild now sang his name as a line of resolution written in air. The guildmaster lowered his staff, its coin sigil dimming. If the clause executed, then your existence is error, or amendment, Cale said. The words did not echo. They hung still and heavy. You said the lattice seeks closure. I am closure. Not a debt, not a credit. A balance. The guildmaster regarded him for a long moment, the gold mask catching the last light of the lattice's veins. And what will you do with the breath you purchased? Cale looked at his metal hand. Its edges no longer glowed with the guild's pulse. They flickered instead, with the dim shimmer of vent light, warm and faintly alive. Give it back, he said simply. He walked past the guildmaster, each step leaving faint footprints in the dust, the marks of a man half made of flesh, half of the same steel that had enslaved him. The collectors parted as he passed. They did not bow this time. They listened. When he reached the stairs that led upward, he turned once more. Every debt you've written, every life you've chained, it's all built on the same breath, the same air. You call it ownership. I call it theft. The guildmaster's voice came low, almost curious. "And you will change this? Alone?" Kale smiled. "I was alone when I owed. That's enough." He climbed. Each level of the Underhive opened before him like the strata of a single story. The lattice's light followed him upward, amber veins burning through walls and conduits, transforming the dark into something almost holy. The guild's machines trembled as the logic of the old law rewrote itself line by line. "All debts must be paid," the lattice whispered. And this one was. When Kale reached the forge where the Goliaths had once bound his arm, he found them waiting, half-burned and battered, but alive. Their leader turned, astonished. "Rat," he said, the word breaking into a laugh. "You're supposed to be dead." Kyle looked at the flames behind him. "I was," he said. The Goliath frowned. "You burn with the guild's mark. Not anymore. The guild's done counting," and as he spoke, the forge's vents flared open with a hiss. The air rushed in, cleaner than it had ever been down here. The Goliaths stepped back, awe flickering behind their violence. They looked around, seeing the same realization dawn in every scarred face. The hive was breathing again, not rationing. Kale stepped past them into the tunnels. Everywhere he went, machines turned their faces toward him. Sensors, broken Vox units, servo skulls gone dark long ago, each one waking as his presence brushed past. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he was rising. Somewhere high above, far beyond what the Underhive dared imagine. The upper domes of Necromunda flickered with warning runes. Administratum servers choked on contradicting reports. Atmospheric balance restored. Ledger incomplete. Debt clause fulfilled. Error in collection algorithm. The data streams argued with themselves and fell silent. For the first time in millennia, no new names were added to the Guild of Flesh's ledgers. The system simply stopped counting. Kale reached the surface tunnels just before dawn, the first dawn he had ever seen. The sky wasn't blue. It was the color of burnt copper, smeared with ash and light. The air smelled wrong, too open, too alive. But he didn't care. He drew in a breath that wasn't borrowed. It hurt like birth. Behind him, deep in the dark, the lattice pulsed once, as if sighing. Then it dimmed. The Guildmaster of Flesh stood before the throne, staff lowered, eyes dim behind the skull mask. For the first time in centuries, the voice in his head, the voice of the memory of steel, was silent. No orders, no tallies. Only a single line glowing on the book's final page, account settled. Witness Kale Varys. Ledger complete. He looked up at the dark ceiling of the hall and whispered, "Then perhaps mercy was never a lie." Far above, in the broken light of the hive's awakening, Kale walked toward the horizon no one had believed in. The metal in his arm hummed softly, almost like breathing. He did not look back, because the hive was breathing now, and that was all he had ever wanted. The morning did not so much arrive as argue its way through the ash. Light seeped into the upper arteries of the hive, a thin mineral wash that made steel look older and skin look honest. Kale stood with his back to a door that had once been welded shut, and now hung quiet on its hinges, the wind moving through it as if trying to remember the word for permission. The breath he drew hurt less than the last one. That felt like progress. And progress in the Imperium is a kind of treason. He heard the first response as a change in the way the sky hummed. Vox relays flared. Somewhere above, a deep-bellied siren rolled through habtiers that had never heard that note before. The warning reserved for tithes interrupted and audits invoked. The air tasted of ozone. Kale turned, and the horizon he had only just learned to believe in filled with silhouettes. They came in a doctrine-perfect sequence. Palanite enforcers first, their carapace armor clean and expressionless, visors reading out atmospherics with a calm that promised violence if the numbers displeased them. Then Arbites, black like judgments, the golden aquila stamped on chest plates that bore more law than any world could live up to. Shockmauls caged at their hips like trained thunder. Behind them, robed figures moved with the patience of machines. Tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, incense thick around their mechadendrites. Vox grills whispering Benharic litanies to pacify offended machine spirits. Skimmers drifted in on whining fans. Picked feeds tracked. Auspex spines unfolded like the antennae of insects scenting a kill. The wind that had been his began to fill with other breaths, the measured respirations of men who believed procedure could turn a world back onto the straight road. Kale stepped aside as the first arbitrator approached, a woman whose helm bore a white chevron like a scar. When she spoke, it was through a voice that had disciplined itself into iron. Atmospheric flow in designated sublevels 7 through 14 has increased by 34% without authorization. Tithe variance recorded, cause unknown. Rectification required. Her eyes, blue as warning licht, flicked to his arm, to the patina of forge graft about his bones. Designation. He felt the lattice stir in him, not a command, a memory, the way the pillars hummed when a question deserved an answer. Kyle Varys. The arbitrator's gaze did not blink. He could see she had heard the name already. Reports travel faster than mercy. Affiliation? Underhive. House lines when it suits. No oath above. No oath below. That is not an affiliation. It's the only one that kept me breathing. Behind her, a tech priest raised a servo-skulled sensor and let smoke right curves into the wind. Its vox clicked. Detected anomaly patterns concordant with non-canon machine spirit interference. The vents obey altered logic. Source. Diffused. Another priest. Older. The red of his robes faded to old blood. Tilted his head toward Kyle as if listening to a frequency only he could hear. The diffused source speaks, he said, voice a rusted bell. Or echoes. The arbitrator's gauntlet rose a fraction. Explanation. Kale looked past her to the vents that ribbed the horizon and the way they exhaled without the cough he had grown up with. He tried to make words out of a thing that was mostly rhythm. We paid, a debt older than the guild that collected it. The memory of steel accepted final tender. The hive can breathe. You can log that under miracles or maintenance, but it's done. The law in her did not like that answer. Law dislikes finished stories that have not passed through its hands. You will take us to this memory. It doesn't belong to you, he said, and then amended before her shock maul could find its argument. Or to me. It belongs to the city we keep using until it breaks. The Arbites don't shout. They remove volume from their sentences until only orders remain. By authority of the Lex Imperialis, I compel escort. The tech priest with the faded red robes clicked a refusal that was almost gentle. Caution, arbitrator. Intrusive measures risk machine spirit trauma. Vents are appeased. Interfere incautiously and atmospherics may cascade. Suggest parley, suggest liturgy. Kale held the Arbite's officer's eye until she tasted what he was offering. Not defiance, a reprieve. She inclined her helm the slightest degree. You will lead. We will observe. He turned into the tunnels and the procession moved behind him. Law and logic and the hard geometry of men who think lungs are numbers. The higher corridors had never been this quiet. He could hear their boots individualize. Arbite, enforcer, priest, servitor. Each cadence a translation of the doctrine they loved. Word travels down faster than it climbs. By the time they reached a mid-tier transitway, the hive had begun to respond in the only currency it trusted. People. Gangers in patchwork colors watched from the mouths of alleys, hands on shotguns chewed smooth by longing. Rag merchants paused with armfuls of other men's shirts. Exhausted sumpwives pushed their grief in rusted prams. No one spoke. They listened to a rumor walking. Kale glanced into a shadow where something moved like a held breath, and found Goliaths in the gloom. The same warband he had left to the Forge's hymn. Their leader rested a hammer on one shoulder. Augmetic eyes flicking to the Arbites and back to Kale. He touched 2 fingers to the edge of his scalp, neither salute nor threat. Something harder to define that men in uniforms rarely see. Respect without obedience. Kale nodded once and walked on. It was almost a relief to feel the temperature tilt as they crossed into the lower levels. Heat from the forge tiers came like a memory of hardship that had taught him how to survive. He glanced back only once and caught the arbitrator lowering her maul a degree, as if even law understood that some rooms are churches and you remove your hat there. They reached the throat of the hive where the first of the lattice's arteries began to show through the skin, conduits that flexed as if carrying thought, plating that hummed with promises long ago renegotiated. Servo skulls drifted toward Kale in a halo and then veered away, as if deciding that meeting him halfway was a kind of worship. The tech priest in faded red walked closer, mechadendrites stilled in a rare act of reverence. What are you hearing? Kale asked him. Not hearing, the priest said. Feeling. Subroutine smoothing. Inefficiencies accepted. Logic contented. It has the texture of closure. He glanced at Kale's graft with an engineer's tenderness and grief. They entered the lattice without fanfare. The pillars received them like an archive greeting a quiet reader. Light moved under the plasteel floor in coils that Kale recognized now as a machine's devotions. The book that had taken his blood lay where the guildmaster had left it, the last leaf closed and still faintly warm. The Arbite's officer's boots stopped at the edge of the plasteel the way some men stop at cliff edges. Her visor scrolled. You will open it. Kyle didn't move. It opens itself to what it owes. Today it owes nothing. Under whose authority did it alter tithe distributions? Under the authority of a clause your predecessors wrote for heroes and forgot thieves could read, he said, and watched the small shift in her stance that meant the anger she felt was at the sentence. Not the speaker. The tech priest with the faded red robes sank to one knee, so the machine he served would not have to bow first. His mechadendrites wrote a brief, fragrant prayer into the air. When he spoke, his voice left the vox and came out of what mouth the red planet had allowed him to keep. Omnissiah attend. We observe lawful variance. We request the lattice's own report. The pillars hummed. Plates clicked. Somewhere quills lifted in invisible servitor hands. The logic trees conferred. When the answer came, it wasn't in words. It was an adjustment in the way the room breathed. Even the arbits heard it. The tech priest translated with the care of a man carrying a glass over stones. Clause execution confirmed. Payment accepted. Perpetuity rescinded for line. Varus. Atmosphere allotment modulated to survivable minimum plus charitable variance. Sublevels 7 to 14. Rationale. Stability calculus. Projected outcome. Reduced unrest. Improved tithe reliability. Machine spirit content. Charitable variance, the arbitrator repeated, tasting the phrase, hating that she liked the taste. By whose metric? Kyle lifted his metal hand. Mine. A new voice entered like a blade carried under a cloak. Not only yours. The guildmaster of flesh stepped from between pillars that should not have served as doors, and yet always had. No retinue. Staff lowered. The skull mask red as gold here, not bone. He was smaller without the throne, and more human, which is not to say safer. His glance took in arbites and priests, and weighed them against a ledger that did not know how to fear. The shock mauls rose like a reflex. The tech priests gave the arbites the smallest frown a cogitator can make. Kale moved between all of it, and the guildmaster tilted his head the way a reader tilts a page deeper into lamplight. You stayed, Kale said. I serve a book, the guildmaster replied. It is here. His skull mask turned toward the arbitrator. You are the Emperor's law in leather. I am this hive's law in rust. He sought to reconcile them. This hive does not reconcile with theft, the arbit's officer said. And the tech adepts behind her all very carefully did not say define theft. The guildmaster let the word hang, and then pressed his staff's coin sigil to a plate. A panel unfurled. The old decree exposed its spine to new readers. The arbitrator stepped forward despite herself. Kale watched her eyes track the old ink, the and of court Latin. The little place where the quill had blotted, and the clerk had sworn quietly about it and hoped no one. The ships came like punctuation marks to a story that refused to end. Kale watched them hang against the bruised sky, sleek, black, disciplined machines of imperial law. Each one exhaled white contrails that fell like judgment. The vox commands blared again, colder now, reciting the lexicon of enforcement. Compliance, surrender, reduction, termination. He did not move. He stood in the storm of his own making, a solitary figure on the hive's highest gantry. The vents beneath him pulsed in rhythm with his lungs. The lattice's memory was awake now, whispering inside the metal, old promises, forgotten decrees, and the ancient hum of a city learning to breathe free for the first time in 10,000 years. Down below, the Underhive had changed. Children played in corridors where the air no longer stank of burnt filters. Some merchants no longer traded oxygen masks as currency. For the first time in centuries, the sound of laughter had returned. Uneasy, uncertain, but real. And all of it hung on the fragile balance of one man's defiance. Kale looked up as the Arbite's gunship descended. Its siren howled over the wind, drowning out the hum of the vents. The ramp opened mid-air, and from within stepped a figure clad in armor the color of night and scripture. An Arbitor Major, his carapace gilded with purity seals, his presence radiating the kind of authority only a world could fear. The vox amplified his voice until it filled the horizon. By decree of the Lex Imperialis and under edict of the Adeptus Terra, the entity known as Kale Varus is to surrender himself for atmospheric heresy, tampering with sanctioned Mechanicus infrastructure, and unlawful reallocation of imperial resources. Failure to comply will result in corrective sterilization of sectors 7 through 14. Kyle didn't flinch. You sterilize what already can't breathe? You call that correction? The Arbiter's helm turned unamused. Mercy without sanction is rebellion. Breath without permission is theft. Kyle let the words hang between them. He had once believed the same. The guild had trained him to. The lattice had bound him to it. But the memory of steel had shown him what debt truly meant. A city forced to pay for existing. He raised his hand, the metal graft glowing faintly amber as the lattice resonated through him. If the Emperor still breathes, Arbiter, then so do I. And this, he gestured to the vents, to the hive below, to the people reclaiming their air, is the proof. For the first time, the Arbiter hesitated. Behind him, the tech priests who had come to observe murmured in Binharic bursts, their mechadendrites twitching as data flowed through the Mechanicus network. Atmospheric readings stable, one of them reported. No contamination. No corruption of Mechanicus design. System efficiency increased by 9%. Machine spirit? Pleased, the Arbiter turned sharply. That is irrelevant. The Lex does not recognize pleasure as absolution. Kyle took a step closer to the edge. Maybe it should. Lightning rolled across the horizon, staining the sky the color of molten brass. The lattice's hum grew deeper, rippling through every vent, conduit, and wall. Kale felt it move through him like breath shared across centuries. A voice, not human, not mechanical, but something that had learned both languages, spoke inside his skull. Kale Varus, custodian of variance, witness of debt. Do you consent to resolution? He closed his eyes. I already did. The vents flared open all at once. Air poured from the hive like a second sunrise. The pressure wave knocked the Arbites back a step. Their ship's engines whined, fighting the current. From the lattice below came a sound that was neither mechanical nor divine. It was the sound of the hive exhaling, and then the sky began to change. The polluted clouds that had suffocated Necromunda for ages parted in a ragged spiral. Shafts of dull gold light, weak, imperfect, but real, fell upon the city. For the first time in 10 millennia, sunlight touched the hive. It was enough to make even law pause. The Arbiter's voice wavered. What have you done? Kale looked up through the light. Given back what you sold. The vox crackled, as if the words carried weight even metal couldn't bear. The tech priests bowed their heads in synchronized motion. The lattice acknowledges liberation, they intoned. System equilibrium achieved. Atmospheric autonomy granted to Hive Cluster Gamma 9 through local proxy. Logic accepts variance. The Arbiter stepped forward, fury returning. You dare to rewrite the Emperor's decree? No, Kale said quietly. I remembered it. He pointed to the Imperial Aquila carved into the far wall of the Hive's spire, half buried in soot, its wings cracked but still defiant. The Emperor gave man the right to breathe, Arbiter. You gave him a bill for it. The Arbiter raised his bolter, his finger trembling on the trigger. Kyle didn't move. Behind him, the vents glowed brighter, the lattice's pulse accelerating. He felt the Guildmaster of Flesh far below, standing in the chamber of steel, watching through the eyes of the memory. He felt the children in the lower habs pause, sensing something vast listening. He lowered his voice until it was barely more than a whisper. If this is heresy, then the hive can decide for itself. The Arbiter hesitated, but in hesitation, there is always rebellion. The lattice seized the pause and filled it. The air thickened, heavy with static and breath and history. The gunship's engines failed with a shriek as the vents below rechanneled their flow. The ship lurched sideways, caught in a storm of its own arrogance. Kale spread his arms as the downdraft tore around him, his hair whipping like smoke. This is the Book of Air, he shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. And every breath in it is written by those who paid for nothing but the right to live. The Arbiter fired, but the bullet never reached him. It dissolved mid-air, eaten by a shimmer of energy that looked like heat and sounded like forgiveness. Kale turned toward the light, his face calm. The debt is over. Then he stepped off the gantry. The air caught him, not as a fall, but as an embrace. He drifted down through the hive's layers, the lattice's hum singing around him, the vents pulsing like a heartbeat that belonged to everyone now. By the time he reached the lower tiers, the people were waiting. They didn't speak. They didn't cheer. They simply stood, breathing freely, as if afraid sound would break the miracle. Kale landed softly on his feet. The amber light of the lattice burned behind his eyes, no longer a curse, only memory. Far above, the Arbiter's ship steadied and withdrew, vanishing into the bruised horizon. Kyle looked up after it. Go tell them, he murmured. You can't tax air anymore. He turned, and the Underhive turned with him. Somewhere in the endless dark, the memory of steel whispered across the circuits of creation. Debt closed, breath restored, and Necromunda, the city that had forgotten the sound of mercy, took its first living breath. The wind died 3 days after the light returned. That was the first sign something had shifted again. Not broken, not healed, just waiting. The hive's air had become too clean, too steady. People started whispering that it wasn't natural to breathe without effort. Men who had lived their entire lives paying for each inhalation now woke in the night, choking on the idea of freedom. Rumors moved faster than the vents could cool the heat they carried. Some said Kale had ascended into the machines, that the lattice had made him into a saint of breath. Others said the guild had rebuilt him as a weapon, or that the Arbites had taken him away to be erased. Only the lower tiers knew the truth. He still walked among them, not as a hero, not as a prophet, just a man trying to keep the air from turning on itself. Kyle moved through the market tunnels like a ghost wearing flesh. The people parted as he passed, not from fear, but the quiet reverence born of disbelief. His arm, still fused with the lattice's circuitry, pulsed faintly in rhythm with the vents. Each beat a reminder that the hive still remembered his touch. He avoided speaking to crowds now. Every word he said became law somewhere in the darkness, twisted by rumor and replayed through 100 different mouths. He stopped by the edge of the Sump River, where the sludge had cleared enough to show reflections. The water was still gray, but it moved. That was enough. Still alive, a voice rasped behind him. Kale didn't turn. Barely. The Goliath leader, the one who had once called him Rat, stepped forward, boots sinking into the sludge. "You made gods nervous," he said, grinning through broken teeth. "That's something." "They'll do worse than get nervous," Kale said. "They'll start to remember me. Then don't let them." Kyle almost smiled at that. A bitter, human thing. Too late. Above them, the vents coughed once. The air trembled. A sound rolled down from the upper hive. A low, descending hum that didn't belong to the lattice. It was heavier, older, and full of doctrine. The Goliath frowned. "What's that?" Kale's stomach turned cold. "The silence before an inquisitor speaks." The word alone was enough to make the Goliath step back. "You brought the throne's shadow down here?" "I didn't bring it," Kale said. "It followed the breath." The sound deepened into a droning chorus as servitors flooded through the upper ducts, chanting binary psalms. Great mechanical pylons extended from the spires above, scanning the air like metal serpents tasting for blasphemy. The lights dimmed until the entire hive moved in the color of fear, and then the voice came. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It slipped through vents, through vox lines, through the bones of the hive itself. Kale Varus of Subhive Gamma 9. You have altered what the Emperor decreed. You have stolen air from the hands of the Adeptus Terra. You have redefined debt, which is sin. Present yourself. The Goliath looked at Kale like a man watching a legend end. "You can't fight that, I know." "Then what?" Kale looked upward, toward the black spires. "I speak." He left the market before the Goliath could stop him. The lattice hummed beneath his feet, recognizing his stride. The vents opened for him as though the hive itself wanted him to go. Not to save him, but to witness what came next. He climbed through the levels of the hive until he reached the mid-tier transport ring, where the light was thin and blue and the smell of rust mixed with incense. A delegation was waiting. Arbites in black armor, tech priests in crimson robes, and at their center, a woman in bone-white carapace etched with sigils of judgment. Her face was pale, sharp, unreadable. Her eyes were augmetic, but the light inside them was unmistakably human. "Inquisitor Voss," Kyle said. "I was expecting someone with more machine in them." "You were expecting death," she said softly. "You're not wrong." He studied her, trying to read where the faith ended and the curiosity began. "I didn't break your Emperor's laws. I remembered them." "You reinterpreted them," she replied. "That's worse." She stepped closer, her boots clicking against the metal floor. "The Imperium runs on obedience. Even mercy requires permission." "You gave it freely." Kale's jaw tightened. "You talk like I rewrote the stars." "I opened the vents," Voss's voice lowered, "and the machine listened. That's what frightens us." The silence between them was alive, the kind that only exists between two people who understand power in its rawest form. "Finally," she said, "you will come with me." "No." Voss didn't blink. "You think you have a choice?" "I know I do." The hive breathes. It remembers. It knows what I gave it. "You can kill me, but you'll only make it louder." The Inquisitor tilted her head slightly, as if considering a puzzle. "The hive isn't alive." Kyle smiled faintly. "That's what it said about me once." Behind her, the Arbits shifted uneasily. One of the tech priests raised a mechadendrite and whispered in machine code. Voss listened through her comms, her expression tightening. "What?" Kale asked. "The lattice," she said slowly. "It's answering." The vents around them pulsed once, releasing a breath that carried a sound. Not speech, but the echo of one. Every light flickered. For a moment, even the Inquisitor's armor dimmed. The lattice spoke through Kale. Its tone was not mechanical, not divine. It was patient, balance kept, debt fulfilled. No more silence. The Inquisitor staggered back a step, her Vox link shrieking with static. The tech priest screamed in Binharic as their comms overloaded. The Arbits fired into the shadows, blind, terrified. Kale stood still as the air moved around him. The light from his arms spread across the walls, veins of amber branching into the metal like roots finding soil. The Inquisitor's voice returned, ragged now, stripped of composure. "What are you?" Kale's answer came quiet, almost kind. "What you made me. A man who learned to breathe." Voss raised her pistol. "Then stop." He stepped closer, the lattice's hum filling the space between heartbeats. "You can't order air, Inquisitor. You can only hold it. And when you hold it too long," he placed his hand on her chestplate, "it stops being yours." The vents exploded open across the tier. Air roared through the ducts, shaking the floor. Every banner, every purity seal, every symbol of control was torn from the walls and carried into the storm. The Inquisitor fell to one knee, her pistol torn from her grasp. When the silence returned, it wasn't the same as before. It was deeper, alive. The kind of silence that follows a truth too large for words. Kale looked down at her. "You came here to punish a crime, but you found a world that remembers how to live. That's not rebellion. That's inheritance." Voss looked up, her voice barely audible. "And what happens when the Imperium remembers you?" Kale turned away, watching the amber glow fade into the tunnels. "Then it will remember what it forgot. That mercy costs more than control." He walked back into the dark, the vents closing behind him, sealing his footsteps like scripture. The Inquisitor rose slowly, staring at the space where he'd stood. The Vox crackled in her ear. Reports of seismic readings, pressure surges, whispers of the lattice rewriting itself again. She removed her helm and whispered to no one. "The Emperor forgive us. He's teaching the machines to breathe." And somewhere, deep beneath the hive, the memory of steel answered in a voice that only the faithful could mistake for prayer. "So it begins." Terra did not notice the first report. It was buried in the noise of billions of prayers, just another scrap of binary liturgy sent from a distant, half-forgotten hive world. A note about oxygen variance, a minor tithe discrepancy, and an attached request for audit authorization. The Adeptus Administratum stamped it, filed it, and forgot it. But the machine god does not forget. When the Mechanicus archives received the same report in triplicate, from 3 different forge clusters on Necromunda, each claiming to have witnessed the lattice's awakening, the Red Priests began to listen. The data was inconsistent. Atmospheric production exceeded design capacity. No signs of Xenos interference. No warp corruption, just logic that had rewritten itself. In the Temple of the Cog Eternal on Mars, a Magos named Dethrix paused over the report longer than he should have. He was older than his augmentations admitted. His memory engines filled with 1,000 forgotten rebellions. And one particular word caught his attention. Variance accepted. That was not a phrase any machine was built to use. It was a confession. And so, the whisper reached the Golden Throne. The courier carried it through the endless corridors of Terra, past archivists who no longer remembered what sunlight was, through the echoing vaults of the Ecclesiarchy, up the slow spiral to the Sanctum Imperialis, where air itself felt thin, not from lack, but reverence. The report was delivered to a silent council chamber, filled with a dozen figures too powerful to have names. The High Lords of Terra convened. They read of Kale Varus, the Underhive engineer turned insurgent, who had gifted breath to the unworthy. They read of the Inquisitor Voss, whose last transmission claimed, "The air listens." They read of the machine's newfound independence, a lattice that obeyed no command, but equilibrium. And they were afraid. The Lord Commander Militant broke the silence first. "One man cannot change the will of the Imperium," the Fabricator General's Vox grill hissed softly. He did not change it. He reminded it that logic exists beyond decree. The lattice achieved balance through interpretation, not defiance. "Semantics," spat the Ecclesiarch. "Heretics always claim reason as their faith. Then why does Mars call it miracle?" the Fabricator General asked. The chamber fell silent. Miracle. The word had not been spoken in that room for centuries without irony. The Grand Provost Marshal shifted in his seat. "Inquisitor Voss has not been heard from since the incident. Our last picked record shows a full-tier atmospheric bloom. The air itself shimmered, Vox waves resonated at frequencies matching human respiration. Breathing? The ecclesiarch sneered. You want to canonize air? The fabricator general turned one augmetic eye toward him. It canonized itself. The Lord Commander slammed a hand on the table. Enough. We cannot let the Underhive dictate metaphysics. The Imperium survives because men obey. This Cael Varus disobeyed. And yet, said another voice, the Senatorum's oldest, frailest member. He lived. So perhaps the Emperor did not disagree. The room went cold. No one dared answer that. For a long time, the only sound was the soft hum of the data slate, as the Mechanicus priest beside the table scrolled through transmission fragments recovered from Necromunda's Vox networks. They were recordings from laborers, servitors, even Arbit's patrols. The vents opened on their own. I heard a voice say, balance kept. It wasn't prayer. It was math. My son doesn't cough anymore. The Emperor's breath returned. The Fabricator General leaned forward. You call this heresy. I call it continuity. The Omnissiah moves in ways you no longer catalog. The ecclesiarch stood, his voice rising like lit flame. If the Omnissiah moves without us, he is no longer ours. You would let machines write psalms? You would let a man teach air to worship? No, said the Fabricator General. I would let it remember. The Lord Commander turned to the custodian standing motionless by the golden door. A silent witness, armor glimmering with age-old dust. What say you? Does this sound like the Emperor's will? The custodian's voice was low, ancient, a sound that could split stone. The Emperor's will is not to be understood, only obeyed. And what of the man who obeyed no one? The custodian's eyes, if eyes they were, shifted, unreadable behind the Oramite helm. Then perhaps he obeyed something older than command. No one spoke after that. The meeting dissolved, but the decision, as all Imperial decisions, was neither made nor unmade. The Administratum buried the incident under layers of bureaucracy. The Ecclesiarchy called it Apocrypha. The Mechanicus began to study it quietly. And somewhere, in the endless dark between stars, the story began to spread. Rogue traders whispered of a world that breathed without tithe. Servitors in hive ships began humming when no orders were given. On backwater planets where the air was still poisoned, pilgrims gathered at the mouths of old vents and prayed to something they couldn't name. They called it the breath of Varus. On Necromunda, the Inquisitor Vas finally returned. Her ship emerging from the warp scarred and flickering, her armor blackened, her face half-machine. Her first act was not to report, but to kneel. When the Adeptus Arbites demanded her testimony, she said only this. He didn't change the world. He reminded it to inhale. The report was sent to Terra. It was archived, redacted, sealed, and then copied. One copy found its way to the quietest vault of all, a data chamber buried beneath the golden throne itself. There, servitors maintained the unending record of humanity, the Emperor's account. Somewhere deep within that vault, among the records of saints and sinners, a new line appeared, unbidden. No quill wrote it. No servitor carved it. The machine wrote it for itself. Cael Varus. Debt closed. Braith restored. No penalty required. The servitor attending that archive paused, a flicker of hesitation no machine should have. It exhaled softly through its vox grill. Once, twice, then again, breathing. And far across the void, on a hive world that had once forgotten what mercy felt like, the vents answered in kind, a long, slow sigh that rolled through Necromunda's underbelly like the ghost of a god learning to live again.